A determined, kind-hearted bakery worker discovers a fallen stranger in a dark alley, and in a heartbeat, she saves him from death. But the man isn't just anyone. He's a powerful billionaire hiding a secret that could shake her entire neighborhood. When she catches a shocking clue falling from his coat, she knows everything is at stake, and that keeping quiet might be the only way to survive. As whispers of betrayal, hidden deeds, and corporate schemes swirl around them, she must decide who to trust and how far she will go to protect her community. Can a simple act of courage save a fortune, a garden, and a life? And will the shocking truth destroy everything she's fought to protect? The morning sun slanted through the bakery's front windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Eve Barnes had been up since 4 a.m., her hands deep in dough, working with the familiar rhythm that came from years of practice. The steady whir of the mixer filled the kitchen as she added flour to another batch of her signature sourdough. "That'll be $3.50, Mrs. Patel," Maria called from the front counter, her voice warm and cheerful. The bell above the door chimed as another regular customer stepped in, bringing with them a gust of crisp spring air. Eve wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron, leaving white streaks across the faded fabric. The yeasty smell of rising bread filled every corner of Barnes's Bread and Heart, mixing with the sweet aroma of cinnamon rolls fresh from the oven. She glanced at the clock. 7:30, right on schedule for the morning rush. "Morning, Mr. Jensen." Maria greeted the retired postman as he joined the growing line. "The usual today?" "You know it," he replied, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Say, did you folks hear about the Hendersons down the street? Ashford Development made them quite an offer for their place." Eve's hands paused mid-need. She'd been hearing whispers about Ashford Development for weeks now, but this was the first confirmation that they were actually buying properties in the neighborhood. Mrs. Patel turned from the counter, her face creased with concern. "They're not the only ones. The Williamses got an offer too. My daughter says these developers want to build some fancy apartments." The mixer's rhythm seemed to grow louder in Eve's ears as she remembered a spring morning, much like this one, 15 years ago. Tom, her late husband, had been on his knees in their little garden behind the bakery, his hands dark with soil. "This'll be something special, Eve," he'd said, carefully placing tomato seedlings in neat rows. "A little piece of heaven right here in the city." The garden had become exactly that, not just for them, but for the whole neighborhood. Even after Tom passed, Eve had maintained it, sharing its bounty with anyone who needed fresh vegetables or just a quiet place to sit among the greenery. "Eve?" Maria's voice pulled her back to the present. "We need another batch of whole wheat." "Coming right up," Eve replied, sliding a tray of rolls into the oven. She checked the temperature gauge with practiced precision, then moved to prepare the whole wheat dough. The morning rush continued in its familiar pattern. Mr. Jensen lingered at the counter, sharing news about his grandchildren. Mrs. Patel discussed her daughter's upcoming wedding while selecting a loaf of rye. The bell chimed again and again as neighbors came and went, each carrying away paper bags filled with fresh bread and pastries. Through it all, Maria worked the counter with efficient grace, her silver-streaked hair neat under her cap, her movements quick and sure as she counted change and boxed pastries. She'd been Eve's right hand at the bakery for nearly a decade now, and they moved around each other in the small space like dancers who knew all the steps by heart. "Did you hear what Mrs. Chen was saying about the community center?" Maria asked during a brief lull, restocking the display case with fresh croissants. "Ashford's been sniffing around there too, talking about revitalization and urban renewal." Eve frowned as she shaped another loaf. "Fancy words for pushing people out of their homes," she said quietly, her fingers pressing perhaps a bit harder than necessary into the dough. The morning wore on, sunlight climbing higher in the sky. By 10 o'clock, the rush had settled to a steady trickle of customers. Eve checked her delivery lists and began boxing up the day's donations. Slightly imperfect loaves and yesterday's unsold bread, still perfectly good for the church's community room. She untied her apron, shaking off a small cloud of flour. "Maria, I'm going to run these over to the church and check on the garden while I'm out. Can you handle things here for a bit?" "Of course." Maria nodded, already wiping down the counter. "Don't forget we need to order more pastry flour. We're running low after this morning." Eve gathered the boxes of bread, her mind already turning to the garden. In her memory, she could still hear Tom's voice. "A garden's more than just plants, Eve. It's hope growing right up through the concrete." She'd never imagined having to fight to keep that hope alive. But as she prepared to head out for her afternoon errand, she knew that's exactly what she might have to do. The bell chimed one more time as she stepped into the spring sunshine, leaving Maria to mind the store. The boxes of bread were warm in her arms, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. The afternoon sun slanted low through the bakery windows as Eve wiped down the last of the counters. The day's bustle had settled into the quiet rhythm of closing time, with only the hum of the cooling ovens and the gentle clink of Maria organizing the display trays. "These new scones were a hit," Maria said, counting the day's receipts, "though Mr. Jensen still swears by the original recipe." Eve smiled, folding her cleaning cloth. "That man would eat cardboard if we baked it the same way we did 20 years ago." She gathered the boxes of bread for the church donation, stacking them carefully. The warmth of the day's baking still lingered inside them. "Need help with those?" Maria asked, looking up from her counting. "I've got it. Just make sure to lock up properly when you head out." Eve adjusted her grip on the boxes. "And don't forget your daughter's dance recital tonight." The spring air had cooled considerably as Eve stepped outside. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and a light breeze carried the scent of newly budding trees. She walked the short block to St. Michael's, her footsteps echoing off the old brick buildings. After dropping off the bread at the church community room, Eve decided to take the back alley route to check on the garden. The narrow passage between buildings was familiar territory. She'd walked it countless times over the years. A torn poster fluttered against one wall, advertising a community fair from last summer. The Historical Society's storage shed stood halfway down the alley, its weathered wood a testament to decades of service. Eve noticed Maggie's wooden cane leaning against the shed wall. The older woman must be organizing records again. But as she drew closer, she saw something unusual. A man in an expensive charcoal suit was fumbling with the shed's lock, his movements uncoordinated and jerky. His other hand pressed against the wall for support. "Sir," Eve called out, "are you all right?" He turned toward her voice, and Eve saw his face was pale and sweaty. His eyes couldn't seem to focus properly. Before she could reach him, his knees buckled. Eve lunged forward, managing to break his fall enough that his head didn't hit the ground. Papers scattered from his pocket, dancing across the alley in the evening breeze. The metallic tang of fear filled her nostrils as she realized how serious the situation was. "Help!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the brick walls. "Somebody call 911!" The man wasn't breathing. Eve's first aid training from the bakery kicked in. She loosened his tie and began chest compressions, counting under her breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her arms quickly began to ache, but she didn't stop. As she worked, she couldn't help noticing details: the monogrammed cufflinks that probably cost more than a month's worth of flour, the expensive leather briefcase that had fallen nearby. This was no ordinary visitor to their neighborhood. From somewhere nearby, she heard running footsteps and voices. "Over here!" she called out, not breaking rhythm. "In the alley." Mrs. Chen from the flower shop appeared at the alley entrance, cell phone already to her ear. "Ambulance is coming," she called. 2 minutes. Those 2 minutes felt like hours as Eve continued compressions. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, but she forced herself to maintain the steady rhythm. Finally, she heard sirens, then the thunder of approaching footsteps and the clatter of equipment. "Ma'am, we'll take over now," a paramedic said firmly, touching her shoulder. Eve sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of how badly her arms were shaking. She watched as the emergency team worked with practiced efficiency, attaching monitors and starting an IV. "He had a pulse when we got here," one paramedic reported to another. Good CPR made the difference. Eve found herself being helped to her feet by Officer Martinez, who had arrived with the ambulance. "That was well done," he said kindly. "Would you be willing to come to the hospital? They'll need a statement about what happened." Eve nodded, realizing she was still clutching the bakery towel she'd had tucked in her apron. She followed the ambulance to County General in Officer Martinez's patrol car, her mind churning with questions. Why had the man been trying to get into the Historical Society's shed? What were those papers that had scattered in the wind? The emergency room waiting area was bright and sterile, smelling of disinfectant and coffee from the nearby nurses' station. Eve sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, still holding the flour-dusted towel. Time seemed to move like cold molasses as she waited for news. Finally, a nurse in blue scrubs approached her. "Are you the lady who helped the gentleman in the alley?" Eve nodded, standing up. "Is he—" "He's stable," the nurse said with a reassuring smile. "The doctor says your quick action probably saved his life. He had a serious cardiac event, but he's responding well to treatment." Eve's knees went weak with relief, and she sank back into her chair. The man was alive. Whatever else was going on, the locked shed, the scattered papers, the expensive suit in their humble neighborhood, those questions could wait. For now, it was enough to know she'd helped save a life. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow that made everything look pale and washed out. Eve shifted uncomfortably in the hard plastic chair that seemed designed to prevent any kind of relaxation, her fingers absently working at a stubborn spot of dried flour on her apron. The antiseptic smell burned her nose, mixed with the lingering scent of industrial floor cleaner and stale coffee from the nurses' station just down the hall. Every few minutes, another hospital worker would rush past, their squeaking shoes echoing against the linoleum floor. A group of 3 nurses huddled near the desk, their whispers carrying just far enough for Eve to catch fragments of conversation. "Found in the alley behind the old market." Lucky someone was there when he collapsed. Dehydrated and stressed from the looks of it. Eve checked the clock on the wall for what felt like the 100th time. 7:45 p.m. She'd been waiting for over an hour, her mind replaying the scene in the alley like a stuck movie reel. The way the man had stumbled, clutching at his chest, the hollow sound of his expensive briefcase hitting the ground, the scattered papers fluttering in the evening breeze. The look of panic in his eyes before they rolled back. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the memory. The phone at the nurse's station rang suddenly, cutting through her thoughts with its shrill tone. The charge nurse, a woman with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a tight bun, answered, her expression shifting from professional to guarded in an instant. "I'm sorry, but I can't confirm or deny if anyone by that name is here," she said firmly, her voice taking on an edge that wasn't there before. "No, we don't comment on patient status to reporters. That's our policy." Eve's ears perked up at the word reporters. She sat up straighter, straining to hear more. She watched as the nurse hung up and turned to her colleagues, speaking in an urgent undertone. "Channel 5 is asking if Henry Ashford was brought in. Apparently someone reported seeing him trespassing in the old neighborhood over on Maple Street." Henry Ashford. The name hit Eve like a punch to the gut, making her breath catch. The development company's CEO, The man behind all those property buyouts and eviction notices. The man whose company had been pressuring her neighbors for months. She thought back to the expensive suit she'd seen in the alley, the monogrammed cufflinks that had glinted in the fading light, the manicured hands. Suddenly everything made horrible, perfect sense. A doctor in rumpled blue scrubs emerged from the treatment area, running a hand through his graying hair. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he was nearing the end of a long shift. He glanced around the waiting area, then approached Eve directly. "Ms. Barnes?" He's awake but still somewhat confused. His vitals are stabilizing, but we're admitting him overnight for observation. The collapse could have been stress-related, but we want to run a few more tests to be sure. Eve gathered her purse and the small paper bag containing the muffin she'd never eaten, then followed the doctor through sliding doors into the treatment area. The hallway here was narrower, rooms and curtained sections branching off on either side. The man, Henry Ashford, she corrected herself mentally, lay in a curtain-enclosed space at the end, connected to monitors that beeped steadily. His face had more color now, a hint of pink replacing the alarming grey pallor from earlier, but his eyes were unfocused, darting around the room as if trying to piece together where he was and how he'd gotten there. As Eve stepped closer, he tried to push himself up on his elbows, wincing slightly. His mouth opened to speak, probably to demand answers or assert authority as powerful men often did, but Eve moved quickly, placing her hand gently but firmly over his mouth. "Don't talk," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Not yet." His eyes widened in surprise, a flash of indignation crossing his face, but something in her expression, perhaps the intensity or the genuine concern, made him stay silent when she removed her hand. The monitors continued their steady rhythm as they looked at each other, the powerful CEO and the neighborhood baker, connected by this strange moment that felt both intimate and adversarial. A nurse bustled in to check vitals, breaking the tension with her cheerful efficiency. "Blood pressure's better," she noted, making marks on a chart hanging at the foot of the bed. "How are you feeling, sir?" Henry's eyes flickered to Eve before he answered weakly, "Tired, confused." His voice sounded rough, nothing like the confident tones Eve imagined he used in boardrooms. "That's normal after what you've been through," the nurse assured him, adjusting the IV line in his arm. "Do you remember what happened? Anything at all about why you were in that alley?" He frowned, forehead creasing with effort, his fingers plucking absently at the thin hospital blanket. "I was at a shed. I don't remember why." His voice trailed off, uncertainty clouding his expression. "There were boxes and old furniture. I needed to see something, but then—" He shook his head slightly, then winced as if the movement hurt. Eve stood quietly, one hand unconsciously drifting to her apron pocket, her mind on the packet of papers she'd seen fall from his coat pocket when he collapsed. The papers that now sat, folded and slightly stained with alley dirt, in her apron pocket. Whatever had brought Henry Ashford to that shed, their historical society's storage building? She realized with a jolt. Whatever those documents contained, she had a feeling it was important. Perhaps even important enough to explain why the man orchestrating their neighborhood's destruction was sneaking around their property. "You should rest," she said gently, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. The nurse nodded in agreement, adjusting the IV line and smoothing the blanket with practiced hands. Henry's eyes were already drooping, the medication or simple exhaustion pulling him towards sleep, but he managed to ask, "You're the one who helped me? Called the ambulance?" "Yes," Eve answered simply, leaving out how she'd knelt beside him in the dirt, checking his pulse, how she'd loosened his expensive tie while waiting for the paramedics. "But don't worry about that now, just focus on getting better." As his eyes closed completely, Eve made her decision. For now, at least, she would keep his identity to herself. There would be time later to understand why the man who wanted to tear down their neighborhood had been sneaking around their historical society's storage shed. Time to figure out what the papers in her pocket might mean for their fight to save the garden and their homes. Time to decide whether Henry Ashford was merely an enemy or something more complicated. The nurse touched her arm lightly. "You should go home and get some rest yourself," she said kindly, her eyes taking in Eve's flour-dusted clothes and tired face. "You've had quite a day. We'll take good care of him." Eve nodded, taking one last look at the sleeping figure in the hospital bed. The monitors beeped steadily, the fluorescent lights hummed, and somewhere down the hall, a phone rang. Just another evening in the hospital. But Eve knew nothing would be quite the same after today. Whatever had brought Henry Ashford to their neighborhood, it was no coincidence, and she intended to find out exactly what he was looking for. In the treatment room, Henry Ashford slept on, his presence in their neighborhood still a secret, kept between Eve and the night staff. Outside, the city continued its evening rhythm, unaware of how the encounter between these two unlikely people might change everything. Whatever tomorrow would bring, that secret, and the mysterious papers that might hold the key to saving their community, would have to wait until morning. The morning sun streamed through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Eve had returned early, carrying a paper bag with fresh croissants. She found Henry, or whoever he claimed to be, already dressed in his rumpled suit from yesterday, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Good morning," she said carefully, setting the bag down. "I thought you might want something besides hospital food." He looked up, his expression a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thank you. For everything. He glanced at the door, lowering his voice. "I need to ask a favor." Before he could continue, a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Good news," she announced, flipping through papers. "No signs of serious injury. The collapse appears to have been stress-related, possibly combined with mild dehydration. I'm prescribing rest and recommending follow-up with your primary physician." Henry nodded, then spoke in a voice Eve barely recognized, softer, less commanding than she'd expect from a CEO. "Could you list me as Jacob Miller in the records, for privacy?" The doctor raised an eyebrow, but made the notation. "Your vital signs are stable. You're free to go, Mr. Miller. Take it easy for a few days." Once they were alone again, Henry turned to Eve. "The press," he explained, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They'll be looking for me at hotels, my usual places. I need somewhere quiet to recover, just for a day or two." Eve crossed her arms. "And you want to hide out in my bakery?" "The back room," he said quickly. "I saw it yesterday through the window. It looked peaceful." He attempted a smile that came out more like a grimace. "I can pay, of course." "This isn't about money," Eve said firmly. She studied his face, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. Whatever had brought him to that shed, whatever had caused his collapse, it clearly wasn't simple, corporate maneuvering. "Please," he said quietly. "I just need time to think, to figure something out. No one would look for me there." Eve sighed. The baker in her, the one who'd spent decades feeding people and mending their troubles with warm bread and quiet conversation, couldn't quite ignore the lost look in his eyes. "Fine, but we do this my way. No phone calls, no assistant visits, nothing that draws attention." Relief flooded his face. Agreed. An hour later, Eve led him through the bakery's back door, past sacks of flour and industrial mixers, to a small room she sometimes used for afternoon naps during long baking days. A narrow cot stood against one wall, beside a small window that looked out on the garden. "It's not exactly the Ritz," she said, watching him take in the humble space. "It's perfect," he murmured, sinking onto the cot. His hand went to his jacket pocket, where Eve knew the mysterious packet of papers still sat. She brought him water and one of the croissants, setting them on a small table. "You should rest," she said, turning to leave. "Wait." He pulled a crumpled page from his pocket, holding it out. "I was studying this when everything happened. Maybe you could look at it too?" Eve took the paper, smoothing its wrinkles. The letterhead was faded, but she could make out Historical Society and a date from the 1920s. As she scanned the text, certain names jumped out at her, names she knew from old neighborhood stories, from plaques on buildings and corners. "These are the original property deeds," she said slowly. "The families who built this neighborhood." She looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" Henry shook his head. "I'm still piecing it together myself. But those names, they're important. They might change everything about the development plan." Eve studied him for a long moment. The man before her seemed far removed from the corporate titan whose company had been buying up properties, threatening to reshape their community. Here, in her simple back room, he looked almost vulnerable. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help you look into these documents. But on one condition, you stay completely out of the press. No statements, no appearances, nothing that connects you to this neighborhood right now. Deal?" He nodded, relief evident in his posture. "Deal." "Rest now," Eve said, tucking the paper away. "I have a bakery to run. We can talk more later." As she closed the door, she caught a glimpse of Henry settling back on the cot, his eyes already closing. Whatever secrets those papers held, whatever had brought one of the city's most powerful men to hide in her humble bakery, it would have to wait until he'd recovered his strength. Through the door she could hear the familiar sounds of her kitchen, the whir of mixers, the clatter of pans, the murmur of morning customers. Just another day at Barnes's Bread and Heart, except for the CEO sleeping in a back room and the mysterious documents that might change everything. Maria's voice called from the front. "Eve, we need more sourdough." "Coming," Eve called back, straightening her apron. She had a business to run, customers to serve, bread to bake. The mysteries would keep for a few hours at least. Eve spread the papers across her kitchen table, the afternoon sun streaming through the window and catching dust motes in its rays. The golden light illuminated the collection of aged documents, making them seem almost sacred in their fragility. Maria sat beside her, reading glasses perched on her nose, her trained nurse's eyes scanning each document with methodical precision, missing nothing in their weathered pages. "These are so delicate," Eve murmured, carefully unfolding a piece of vellum that had yellowed with age. The paper felt fragile under her fingers, like autumn leaves ready to crumble at the slightest mishandling. She held her breath as she smoothed it flat, afraid that even her exhale might damage the precious artifact. "Cotton rag paper," Maria observed, gently touching a corner with her fingertip. They used better materials back then, not like our throwaway stuff today. See how the ink's barely faded after all this time? She pointed to an elegant signature at the bottom of one document, the flourishes still crisp and defined. "That's iron-gall ink. It basically becomes part of the paper, chemically bonds with it. That's why these have lasted so long." They worked in comfortable silence, sorting the documents into neat piles on the worn wooden tabletop, where Eve had kneaded countless loaves of bread. Property deeds with their formal language and red wax seals, some cracked but still intact, bearing faint impressions of long-forgotten family crests. Ledger entries showing careful columns of numbers and dates in a meticulous hand that spoke of an era when bookkeeping was an art form. And then, Eve's breath caught as she unfolded a letter written in a flowing hand, the penmanship so elegant it seemed to dance across the page. "Listen to this," she said, adjusting her reading glasses further down her nose and leaning closer. "To those who follow in our steps, we build this neighborhood not just for ourselves, but for generations yet unborn. The garden spaces, particularly, must be preserved as green havens amidst the city's growth. In them, we plant not merely flowers and trees, but hope and continuity." Maria leaned closer, her shoulder touching Eve's. "Who wrote it? Sounds like someone who really cared about this place." "Thomas Whitman," Eve said, squinting at the signature beneath the heartfelt words. "He was one of the original founders. My grandmother used to talk about him all the time when I was little. He donated the land for the first library, too. Said he believed books and gardens were the twin pillars of a civilized community." "Look here," Maria said, tapping another document with the eraser end of her pencil, careful not to mark the aged paper. "It mentions a perpetual covenant regarding the maintenance of community green spaces." Her finger traced the formal legal language, following the ornate script. "The covenant runs with the land. That means it's supposed to be permanent, not something that can just expire or be tossed aside when convenient." Eve sat back in her wooden kitchen chair, rubbing her temples where a dull ache was forming. The weight of history and responsibility pressed against her chest. "But what does that mean for us now? For the garden? These papers are beautiful, but will they actually help us stop the bulldozers?" Maria pulled out her phone and checked the time, the modern device looking oddly out of place among the centuries-old documents. "Didn't that young lawyer leave his card last month? The one who came in for sourdough and mentioned property law? He seemed sharp and interested in the neighborhood's history." "Caleb Turner." Eve nodded, already reaching for her own phone buried beneath a stack of napkins. She found his business card tucked in her recipe box between cinnamon and cardamom. "He said to call if we ever needed legal advice. Said he was tired of only serving corporate clients." The phone rang 3 times before a measured voice answered, the tone professional but with an underlying warmth. "Turner Legal Associates. Mr. Turner, this is Eve Barnes from the bakery on Oak Street, the one with the sourdough you liked so much." "Mrs. Barnes." His tone warmed noticeably. "Of course I remember. That bread was the highlight of my week. How can I help you?" Eve chose her words carefully, aware that phone conversations weren't necessarily private. "We found some old documents about the neighborhood, property deeds, and a covenant about green spaces. Quite old, from the founding families. I was wondering if you might take a look. Tell us what they actually mean in today's world." A pause filled with the soft sounds of papers being moved. "This is about the Ashford development? The one they've been advertising downtown?" "Partially," Eve hedged, catching Maria's warning glance. "We just need to understand our options, what these papers might mean for the future of our neighborhood." "Send me photos of everything you have," Caleb said after another thoughtful pause. "Use the secure email address on my card. It's encrypted. And Mrs. Barnes, be very careful with those documents. Don't show them to anyone else until we've spoken." Eve sent the photos while Maria made fresh tea, the comforting scent of chamomile filling the kitchen as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. When Caleb called back 20 minutes later, sooner than Eve had expected, his voice held a note of excitement beneath its professional calm. "There's something here," he said without preamble. "Something significant. The covenant includes a trust clause. If the founding family's intentions are publicly acknowledged and honored, it could create a legal barrier to development. These aren't just historical curiosities, Mrs. Barnes. They could be legally binding." "Publicly acknowledged?" Eve repeated, catching Maria's eye across the table and giving her a thumbs up. What exactly does that mean in plain language? Yes, we'd need someone with standing, someone connected to the current development, to formally recognize the covenant's validity, and preferably someone with resources to handle the legal challenge that would certainly follow. Someone who could withstand the pressure from Ashford Development when they inevitably push back. Eve's hand tightened on the phone as she thought of Henry, or Jacob, as he was still calling himself, resting in her back room, his face drawn with exhaustion even in sleep. The man whose company was behind all this, yet who'd collapsed, clutching these very documents. "I see," she said carefully, not wanting to reveal too much. "Don't do anything yet," Caleb advised, his voice dropping lower as if sharing a confidence. "Let me research precedents for similar cases. But keep those documents safe. Don't let them out of your sight. They could be our key to saving the garden, and maybe even rethinking the whole development. This could be bigger than just one green space." After she hung up, Eve and Maria sat in thoughtful silence. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows in amber beams across the scattered papers, highlighting the careful signatures of people who had tried to protect this place so many years ago. People who had planted gardens and dreams for a future they would never see. "Well," Maria said finally, setting down her teacup with a decisive clink. "We have an angle. But it sounds like we need more than just old papers and good intentions. We need someone with influence to stand up publicly. Someone on the inside." Eve nodded, thinking of their unexpected guest and the way he'd clutched these very documents before his collapse. The conflict she'd seen in his eyes when he'd first awakened. "Maybe we do," she said softly, hope flickering to life inside her chest. "Maybe we do." Maria began gathering the papers, her movements precise and careful as they had been throughout her nursing career. "We should make copies," she said practically. "Digital backups, too, stored in several places, and find a safe place for the originals. These are too precious to risk losing." "The bank has safety deposit boxes," Eve suggested, wrapping the most delicate documents in clean baker's parchment, the kind she used for her finest pastries. "We can go first thing tomorrow. I know the manager, she'll help us." They worked together, preserving history with gentle hands, cataloguing each piece and placing them in protective sleeves that Maria had run home to fetch. Outside the kitchen window, the garden waited in its quiet spring glory, tulips nodding in the evening breeze, unaware of the forces gathering to either destroy or save it, and unaware of the unexpected, alliance forming between an unlikely trio, a baker with a generous heart, a lawyer with a conscience, and a businessman who might yet find redemption. 2 days had passed in a blur of activity. The hospital paperwork had taken hours to process, with Eve carefully deflecting questions about Jacob's identity. She'd arranged for him to rest quietly in the bakery's back room, bringing him simple meals and checking his recovery between batches of bread. Meanwhile, she'd thrown herself into preparations for the upcoming Heritage Fair. The annual celebration of their neighborhood's history seemed more important than ever now. She'd spent evenings sorting through old photos and recipe cards, planning displays that would showcase their community's deep roots. Now, on a bright Thursday morning, Eve stood at her kitchen window, coffee cup warming her hands. The spring sun was just beginning to peek over the rooftops when she spotted a figure in the garden. It took her a moment to recognize Henry in his new attire, faded jeans, a plain grey sweatshirt, and work boots that still had their store tags showing. He looked completely out of place, holding a shovel like it might bite him. Maggie was already there, settled on her favorite bench with her cane propped beside her. Eve watched as the older woman called Henry over, showing him how to grip the tool properly. "No, no." Maggie's voice carried clearly through the morning air. "You're not conducting an orchestra, young man. Plant your feet wider. Let the shovel do the work." Henry's attempts at turning soil were awkward but earnest. Eve could see the determination in his stance, even as neighborhood children gathering for school pointed and giggled at his clumsy efforts. "Look at that fancy man playing in the dirt," one little boy called out, making his friends laugh. Henry straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. Instead of showing anger, he smiled sheepishly at the kids. "Want to show me how it's done?" To Eve's surprise, several children dropped their backpacks and ran over. Soon they were giving him an enthusiastic, if somewhat chaotic, lesson in garden work. Eve slipped on her jacket and headed outside. A few neighbors passing by cast suspicious glances at the newcomer, but others nodded greeting. Mrs. Chen from the corner house even brought over a pitcher of water and paper cups. "Every garden needs good drink," she said simply, setting it on the bench beside Maggie. As the morning warmed, more residents stopped by. Some helped for a few minutes between errands, others just watched. Eve noticed how Henry gradually relaxed, his movements becoming more natural as he worked alongside the others. During a water break, he sat on the ground near Maggie's bench, stretching his obviously sore muscles. "My sister would have loved this garden," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She used to grow roses before." He trailed off, picking at a loose thread on his sweatshirt. Maggie's face softened. "Tell me about her." "She died young. Cancer." Henry's voice was rough. "But she always said gardens were where miracles happen, where life insists on growing, no matter what." Eve, pretending to weed nearby, saw Maggie reach out and pat his shoulder. The gesture was brief, but genuine. By early afternoon, the garden looked noticeably better. Fresh mulch lined the paths, winter debris had been cleared away, and early spring bulbs stood tall in newly turned soil. Eve noticed a delivery truck quietly dropping off supplies, bags of compost, new tools, replacement boards for the benches. She caught Henry's eye, and he shrugged slightly, a small smile playing at his lips. More than the physical improvements, though, Eve noticed how the day had changed the garden's energy. Children had stayed to help instead of rushing home after school. Neighbors who usually hurried past had stopped to chat. Even the most skeptical observers had softened after watching Jacob work so humbly alongside everyone else. As the afternoon light began to fade, Eve brought out a tray of fresh rolls and her special herb butter. People gathered around, sharing the simple meal with dirt still under their fingernails. Henry sat slightly apart, looking tired but content. "You did good work today," Eve said, offering him a roll. He took it carefully, his hands showing blisters from the unaccustomed labor. "I have a lot to learn," he admitted. "But it feels right, somehow. Being here, doing something real." Eve nodded, understanding more than she let on. She'd seen how he watched the children playing, how he listened to Maggie's stories, how he'd quietly absorbed the rhythm of community life. It wasn't trust yet, not completely, but it was a beginning. As people began heading home, Henry helped pack away the tools. Eve noticed him slipping an envelope into Maggie's basket, probably containing funds for more repairs, but she pretended not to see. Some things needed to happen in their own time, in their own way. The garden lay peaceful in the evening light, its paths newly swept, its borders freshly edged. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more trust to build, more history to protect. But for now, this was enough. A day of honest work, shared purpose, and small steps toward understanding. The next 5 days unfolded in a whirlwind of activity. Each morning, Eve arrived at the bakery before dawn, her mind racing with lists and plans even as she shaped the day's bread. On Monday, Maria spread sheets of paper across the bakery's back counter after the morning rush. "We need something eye-catching," she said, sketching layout ideas for flyers. "Something that makes people stop and think, Eve watched her friend work, admiring how Maria's steady nurse's hands drew clean lines across the page. "What about photos of the garden? The old ones Maggie has?" "Perfect." Maria nodded, jotting notes. "We'll show then and now. People need to see what we could lose." That afternoon, Maggie set up camp in her favorite corner of the bakery with an old tape recorder. "Come sit," she called to anyone who walked in. "Tell me your garden story." The stories poured out. First dates on garden benches, children learning to plant tomatoes, memorial services where flowers from the garden covered every surface. Eve kept the coffee flowing as Maggie captured it all, her wrinkled hands steady on the recorder. Tuesday brought an unexpected email from Mayor Louise Reed's office. "The mayor would like to discuss your community initiative." The message read. Eve's hands shook as she showed it to Maria. "Be careful," Maria warned. "Politicians always want something." Meanwhile, Caleb's encrypted messages arrived regularly, full of legal terminology that made Eve's head spin. "The covenant has teeth," he wrote, "but we need proof of continuous community use. Photos, records, anything dated." Henry appeared briefly that evening, leaving a manila envelope on the counter without a word. Inside, Eve found enough cash to cover printing costs for hundreds of flyers. Wednesday saw volunteers streaming through the bakery's back door. Mrs. Chen brought her church group's mailing list. Mr. Jensen offered his garage for storing fair supplies. Even the crossing guard promised to spread the word to school parents. Eve baked constantly. Coffee cake for morning meetings, sandwich rolls for working lunches, cookies for evening planning sessions. The smell of yeast and sugar wrapped around serious conversations about zoning laws and property rights. "The Heritage Fair needs to feel like a celebration," Maria insisted during Thursday's planning meeting. "Yes, we're fighting for something serious, but people come to fairs for joy." They gathered around a makeshift map of the garden, marking spots for information tables, photo displays, and activity stations. Maggie's oral histories would play on speakers, letting the neighborhood's voices fill the air. "What about music?" someone suggested. "The high school band might come." Ideas bloomed like spring flowers. Face painting, seed planting demonstrations, a timeline of the garden's history stretching along the fence. Eve watched her neighbors take ownership of the plan, each person adding their own touch. Friday morning, Eve met Mayor Reed at City Hall. The mayor's office smelled of leather and furniture polish, everything arranged just so. "This is quite an undertaking," Mayor Reed said, studying the fair proposal. Her voice was carefully neutral. "The city appreciates community engagement, but development brings jobs, tax revenue. So does preserving history," Eve replied firmly. "This garden isn't just empty land waiting to be filled. It's part of who we are." The mayor tapped her pen thoughtfully. "I'll attend your fair. That's all I can promise for now." By Friday evening, the team gathered for a final check-in. Maria spread the finished flyers across the bakery tables. Beautiful designs, showing the garden through the seasons. Maggie had filled 3 tapes with stories. Caleb's latest email outlined the legal precedents they'd need to reference. "The fair is set for next Saturday," Eve announced. 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. "Weather forecast looks good," Maria added. "Sunny and mild." Looking around at her determined neighbors, Eve felt a surge of hope. Whether they won or lost, they were standing together. That counted for something. The last task was hanging flyers in shop windows. Eve and Maria walked the neighborhood as sunset painted the sky pink, taping up notices, their shadows long on the sidewalk. "Whatever happens," Maria said, smoothing a flyer against glass, "we're doing the right thing." Eve nodded, thinking of Henry working in the garden, of Maggie's collected stories, of all the hands and hearts coming together. The Heritage Fair wasn't just about saving land. It was about proving that a community could still stand up for what mattered. They finished their round just as streetlights flickered on. Tomorrow would bring more work, more planning, more details to manage. But tonight, Eve let herself feel proud of what they'd already accomplished. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Eve unlocked the garden gate. The morning air held that special crispness that promised a perfect day. She checked her watch. 6:30, plenty of time before the Heritage Fair would begin. Maria arrived moments later, arms full of tablecloths and handmade signs. "The tables are coming in 20 minutes," she announced, setting down her load. "And Mrs. Chen's bringing the chairs right after." Like clockwork, the neighborhood came alive. Mr. Jensen's pickup truck rattled down the alley, loaded with folding tables. The high school band kids, still yawning, started setting up their instruments near the rose trellis. Maggie settled into her storyteller's chair, surrounded by old photos and her tape recorder. Jacob appeared quietly around 7, wearing work clothes and carrying a toolbox. Eve watched him make his way to a broken bench, his movements careful and deliberate. No one would guess he was Henry Ashford, billionaire developer. Here, he was just another pair of helping hands. By 9:30, everything was ready. Strings of paper lanterns swayed between trees. Information boards displayed the garden's history in photos and news clippings. Eve's bake stall overflowed with fresh bread and cookies, the scents mixing with morning flowers. "First group's here!" Maria called as families began streaming through the gate. Children ran to the face-painting station, while parents studied the timeline stretched along the fence. The high school band struck up a cheerful tune. At 10 o'clock sharp, Maggie began the children's story hour. Little ones gathered on blankets around her chair as she opened a worn photo album. "This garden," she began, her voice warm and strong, "has been here longer than any building around us. My grandmother used to tell me—" The morning flowed like honey. People signed the community petition, adding personal notes about what the garden meant to them. Eve lost count of how many times she refilled the cookie plate or pointed visitors toward the historical displays. "Look who's here," Maria whispered around noon. Mayor Reed had arrived, dressed casually, but carrying herself with political awareness. She toured the displays, nodding thoughtfully at the legal information, smiling at children planting seedlings. When it was time for speeches, the mayor took the microphone first. "What I see today," she said, looking around at the crowd, "is not just a garden. It's a living piece of our city's soul. While progress is important, we must also honor the places that give our community its heart." She paused, making eye contact with various faces. "If public support remains this strong, you'll find City Hall very interested in preservation options." The crowd burst into applause. Eve caught Henry's eye across the garden. He was actually grinning, hammer still in hand from fixing the bench. After lunch, Mr. Rodriguez, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 83 years, shared his testimony. "My wife and I had our first kiss on that bench right there," he said, pointing with his cane. "Our children learned to walk on these paths. When she passed, we scattered some of her ashes under her favorite rose bush." His voice cracked. "You can't put a price on memories like that." The afternoon brought more music, more stories, more signatures. Children played tag around the flower beds while their parents swapped gardening tips. Maggie's recorded histories played through speakers, filling the air with familiar voices sharing beloved memories. Eve barely had time to rest. Between managing the bake stall, coordinating volunteers, and answering questions about the preservation effort, she stayed in constant motion. But every so often, she'd catch glimpses that made her heart swell. Henry teaching a child how to use a level, Maria organizing an impromptu dance circle, Maggie holding court with her endless supply of neighborhood tales. As the sun began to sink, Casting long shadows across the garden paths, the band played one final song. Families lingered, reluctant to leave. The petition clipboard had run out of space. They'd need to attach extra pages. "This," Maria said, helping Eve pack up the remaining cookies, "was perfect." Eve looked around at their temporary paradise. Lanterns starting to glow in the dusk, children's artwork decorating the fence, Henry still quietly working on his third bench repair of the day. The garden had never felt more alive, more essential to the neighborhood's heart. The final highlight came as they were cleaning up. The crowd gathered spontaneously, bursting into applause, not for any speech or performance, but for the garden itself, for the community it represented, for the hope of preserving something precious. In that moment, watching Henry's genuine smile as he ducked his head and continued working, Eve felt the pure joy of a community coming together. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they had created something beautiful today. Eve opened the bakery door at 6 a.m, still riding high from yesterday's successful fair. The morning air felt crisp and clean, carrying the scent of spring flowers from the garden. She hummed as she started the first batch of dough, dusting the counter with flour. Her phone buzzed at 8:45. Maria's text was simple. "Check the news. Now." Eve's flour-covered fingers left smudges on her phone screen as she pulled up the local news website. Her stomach dropped. There, splashed across the homepage, was a grainy but clear photo of Henry slipping an envelope into the Historical Society's drop box. The headline screamed, "Billionaire's secret deals, Ashford CEO's midnight meetings exposed." No, no, no. Eve muttered, scrolling through the article. The reporter had twisted everything, painting Henry's anonymous donation as proof of backroom dealing. They'd even quoted a real estate analyst suggesting Henry was laying groundwork for private negotiations while playing both sides. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Social media exploded with accusations. Someone had started a hashtag, Ashford Lies. Local Twitter accounts were sharing the photos, adding wild theories about corporate conspiracies. At 9:30, Mrs. Patel poked her head in the bakery door. "Eve, dear, there are reporters outside. They're asking about you and that man from yesterday." Eve's hands shook as she checked her messages. Dozens of missed calls. A text from Henry. "Board emergency meeting. Don't talk to press." The bakery's bell chimed as Maria rushed in, looking worried. "It's bad out there. Someone posted a video." Eve watched the shaky footage on Maria's phone. It showed clips from the fair, zooming in on Henry working at the maintenance table. A voiceover identified him as Henry Ashford, CEO of the development company trying to buy the neighborhood. The video ended with accusations that Eve had helped him infiltrate the community under false pretenses. At 10:15, Caleb's call came through. "Eve, listen carefully," he said, his voice tight with stress. "I'm at corporate headquarters. The board is in chaos. They think Henry's been making unauthorized moves to protect himself from liability. There's talk of limiting his authority. But that's not what happened." Eve protested, watching through the window as another news van pulled up outside. "I know, but perception is everything right now. That envelope? It was just a donation, but the timing looks suspicious, and someone leaked his medical records from the night you found him. The board thinks he's having some kind of breakdown." The bakery phone started ringing. Eve recognized the number, City Hall. Taking a deep breath, she answered. "Ms. Barnes," the angry voice of Councilman Peterson barked. "We trusted you to run a legitimate community event. Instead, you harbored a corporate spy while he conducted secret business. The mayor is extremely disappointed." "That's not true," Eve started, but the line went dead. Maria touched her arm. "Look at this." She held up her tablet, showing comments flooding the neighborhood Facebook group. People who'd smiled and chatted at the fair yesterday were now posting angry accusations. Someone had even started a Boycott Barnes Bread page. At 11:45, Eve's phone lit up with a text from Henry. Board email just arrived. They're restricting my authority pending review. Special committee will oversee all neighborhood negotiations. I'm sorry. The lunch rush hour came and went, but the bakery stayed empty except for reporters trying to get comments. Eve watched through the blinds as neighbors hurried past, avoiding eye contact. The garden sat deserted, yesterday's festive decorations still hanging limply in the breeze. We should make a statement, Maria suggested around 1:30, but Eve shook her head. Henry said to wait. Caleb's trying to contain things at the corporate level first. Another text arrived, from Maggie this time. Just got called by 3 different reporters. What should I tell them? Eve's fingers hovered over the keyboard. But what could she say? The truth seemed impossibly tangled now. The envelope had been a donation. The garden work had been genuine. But how could they prove Henry's intentions when everything looked so suspicious from the outside? At 2:00, a final blow landed. The activist who'd posted the video released a follow-up, this time including security footage from the hospital the night Eve found Henry. The clip showed her covering his mouth, which the activist claimed was proof of a conspiracy. What do we do? Maria asked quietly, watching another group of photographers gather outside. Eve stared at the garden through the back window, remembering yesterday's joy, the children playing, Henry's real smile as he fixed the benches. All of it now twisted into something ugly by suspicion and misunderstanding. Her phone buzzed one last time, the corporate email forwarded from Henry, marked confidential. The language was cold and legal. Effective immediately, all development negotiations and community outreach decisions require executive committee approval. Individual board members are prohibited from independent action regarding the Riverside District project. Eve set the phone down, watching the afternoon light fade as reporters continued to gather outside her door. In just a few hours, everything they'd built had started crumbling, buried under an avalanche of accusations and misunderstandings. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the bakery windows as Eve pulled down the blinds, trying to block out the crowd of reporters still camped outside. Their cameras flashed every time someone walked past, hoping to catch another glimpse of scandal. Maria wiped down tables with shaking hands. Another cancellation, she said quietly. The Thompson wedding. They want their deposit back. Eve nodded, her throat tight. The phone hadn't stopped ringing with cancellations since the morning's news broke. Each call felt like another brick in a wall being built between her and the community she'd served for decades. Mrs. Patel, who usually came for her daily sourdough at 4:30, walked past without looking in. Through the gap in the blinds, Eve watched her hurry across the street to avoid the reporters, her familiar purple shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Did you see the mayor's statement? Maria held up her phone, showing the city's official social media post. Mayor Reed's carefully worded message expressed deep concern about potential manipulation of community trust and promised a thorough review of all Heritage Fair proceedings. Eve's hands clenched. Just yesterday, the mayor had stood in the garden praising their community spirit. Now she was running for cover, leaving them to face the storm alone. The bell above the door chimed. Eve turned, expecting another reporter, but instead found Mr. Jensen, her regular morning customer for 15 years. Is it true? He asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. You knew who he was the whole time. It's not that simple, Eve started, but Mr. Jensen shook his head. We trusted you, Eve. This garden, these buildings, they're all some of us have left. And you let the man who wants to tear it all down spy on us. I was trying to... Eve began, but the door chimed again. This time Henry walked in, looking pale and defeated in a rumpled suit. Mr. Jensen's face darkened. Well, if it isn't the puppet master himself. He turned and pushed past Henry, letting the door slam behind him. Henry stood just inside the entrance, his shoulders slumped. The polished corporate facade had cracked completely, leaving something raw and human beneath. The board meeting just ended. He said quietly, "They've appointed an oversight committee. Everything I do now needs triple approval." He pulled out his phone, showing Eve the official memo. "They're saying I've been emotionally compromised by community involvement." Eve felt a mix of sympathy and anger twist in her chest. Did they know about the documents? The original deeds? Henry's laugh was bitter. Oh, they knew. Turns out they've known for years. They buried the information and used me as their public face, knowing I'd take the fall if anything went wrong. He sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. There are op-eds calling me an unstable leader. Social media is having a field day with theories about my mental break. Outside, a reporter noticed Henry through the gap in the blinds. The cameras started flashing again. "I should make a statement," Henry said, standing up. Before Eve could stop him, he walked to the door and stepped outside. The reporters surged forward, microphones thrust toward his face. Eve watched through the window as Henry raised his hands. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not through a PR team or a prepared statement. Just me, speaking honestly. I failed this community by not investigating sooner. I failed my company by letting them hide the truth. And I failed Eve Barnes by putting her in an impossible position." The cameras clicked rapidly as he continued. "She showed me kindness when I was at my lowest. She protected me not because of who I am, but because that's who she is. Someone who helps people in trouble. If you want to blame someone, blame me. But leave her out of it." Eve felt tears prick at her eyes, but they weren't just sad tears. They were angry ones too, because no matter how sincere Henry was now, he had still let her believe in him, let her risk her reputation and her business on his word. When he came back inside, Eve stepped away from his reaching hand. "I think you should go," she said quietly. "Eve, please. You lied to me too, Henry. Maybe not with words, but by omission. You let me think we were building something real here." Henry's face crumpled. It was real. Everything that happened in the garden, everything I learned here, that was real. But it doesn't matter now, does it? Eve gestured to the chaos outside. "My neighbors think I betrayed them. My business is suffering. And you're going back to your corporate world to fight your boardroom battles. I won't let them win." Henry insisted, but they both knew it was too late. The damage was done. "Just go," Eve said, turning away. She heard his footsteps pause at the door. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Then he was gone, swallowed by the flash of cameras and shouted questions as he headed toward the waiting corporate car. Eve watched until the car disappeared around the corner. In the growing darkness, the garden's empty paths seemed to mock all their hopes from yesterday. Maria touched her shoulder gently. "What do we do now?" Eve looked at the closed sign she'd put up hours ago, wondering if she should make it permanent. Through the window, she could see neighbors gathering in small groups, gesturing toward the bakery and shaking their heads. The trust she'd built over decades felt as fragile as pie crust, crumbling under the weight of suspicion and betrayal. "I don't know," she admitted, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I really don't know." The morning sun cast long shadows through Eve's kitchen window as she stared into her untouched coffee. 2 days had passed since Henry's departure, and the world felt slightly off-kilter, like a picture hanging crooked on the wall. Maria bustled around the kitchen, warming cinnamon rolls that hadn't sold at the bakery. "You can't hide forever, Eve. The regulars keep asking about you." I'm not hiding, Eve protested weakly. I'm thinking. Thinking too. Much, if you ask me, Maggie said, settling into a chair with her cane propped against the table. Her wise eyes studied Eve's face. 2 days of thinking is enough to tie anyone's mind in knots. Eve traced the rim of her coffee mug. The bakery's still open. You've been managing fine, Maria. That's not the point, and you know it. Maria set a warm plate in front of each of them. The phone's been ringing with legal calls. Caleb left 3 messages yesterday about timeline documentation. Let it ring, Eve said quietly. Maggie reached across the table and covered Eve's hand with her own weathered one. Remember when Tom passed? You told me you survived by remembering what matters most. The mention of her late husband made Eve's throat tight. The garden was different then. It was pure, simple. Nothing's pure and simple, child. Maggie's voice held decades of wisdom. Life's messy. What matters is how we handle the mess. Maria sat down, her nurse's efficiency showing in how she arranged her napkin. Speaking of mess, we spent yesterday afternoon at the library archives. Show her, Maggie. Maggie pulled out a folder filled with yellowed papers. Found these in the Historical Society records, letters from 1923 when the garden was first planted. Listen to this. She adjusted her reading glasses and read. The children come every day to tend the vegetables. Mrs. O'Malley says her arthritis eases when she sits among the roses. Even in hard times, this small piece of earth gives hope. Eve's eyes stung. That was 100 years ago. And nothing's changed, Maria said firmly, except now we have proof of the legal protection they tried to set up. A knock at the door interrupted them. Eve started to wave Maria away, but Maggie shook her head. Answer it. Hiding won't heal this. Eve opened the door to find Justin, a teenager from the apartment complex across the street. His eyes were red, and he clutched a wrinkled envelope. Mrs. Barnes? His voice cracked. I needed to show you something. Eve led him to the kitchen table, where Maria immediately pushed a cinnamon roll toward him. Justin pulled papers from the envelope with trembling hands. It's a petition, he explained, from people who want to save the garden. But also, he pulled out a handwritten letter. This is from my mum, about last year when she was going through chemo. Eve read the letter slowly, tears gathering as Justin's mother described sitting in the garden during her darkest days, finding peace among the flowers Eve and the neighbors tended. She's in remission now, Justin said quietly. But she says the garden helped save her, and there are other stories too. So many stories. Eve looked at the petition, filled with familiar signatures, names of people who'd bought bread from her for years, people who'd shared their lives over coffee and pastries, people who, despite the recent drama, still believed in what the garden meant. Maggie squeezed Eve's hand. Compassion isn't about perfect outcomes, Eve. It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard, Maria added. Eve stood and walked to her kitchen window. The garden was visible from here, morning light touching the early spring buds. She remembered Tom's hands in the soil, remembered countless community gatherings, children learning to grow vegetables, elderly neighbors finding purpose in tending flowers. We can't just give up, Justin said behind her. My mom says sometimes you have to fight for beautiful things. Eve turned back to the table, where 3 generations waited for her answer. Maria, practical and strong. Maggie, wise and unwavering. Justin, young and full of hope. You're right, she said finally. All of you are right. She picked up the phone Caleb had been calling. Let's get those timeline documents started. Maria, can you get the archive copies certified? Maria was already reaching for her purse. I'll head to the notary now. Maggie, would you be willing to record your memories of the garden's history? We need first-hand accounts." Maggie's eyes twinkled. "Child, I've been waiting 2 days for you to ask." Justin stood straighter. "What can I do?" Eve smiled for the first time in days. "Those petition signatures? We need more, many more. Think you can help with that?" The boy's face lit up. "Yes, Mom." As her kitchen filled with purposeful activity, Eve felt something settle in her chest. The path ahead wasn't clear, but at least she wasn't walking it alone. She picked up her cold coffee and finally took a sip. "Time to get back to work," she said quietly. The garden's waiting. Monday morning found Caleb Turner staring at his office computer, his coffee growing cold. The email from the board glowed harsh on his screen. "Proceed with demolition paperwork as planned. Disregard unsubstantiated historical claims." His fingers hovered over the keyboard. In his bottom drawer, sealed in a manila envelope, lay copies of documents the board pretended didn't exist. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Turner, the board meeting starts in 5 minutes." "Thank you, Janet." His voice stayed steady, professional. Inside, his stomach churned. In the meeting room, executives discussed property values and development timelines. Caleb took careful notes, watching faces. Some seemed uncomfortable, others eager. None mentioned the founding documents. That evening, he met Eve in a quiet coffee shop 3 towns over. "They're pushing ahead like nothing happened," he said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "But I found more. Scanned ledger entries from 1923. Emails about suppressing the covenant." Eve pocketed the drive. "Can we prove they're real?" "I know someone. Dr. Sarah Chen, forensic archivist. She's independent, trusted." Tuesday morning, Dr. Chen received the original documents via secure courier. Her lab smelled of old paper and chemicals. "Fascinating," she murmured, examining the ink under specialized light. This particular iron gall composition was common in the 1920s, and the paper. She made detailed notes. Wednesday brought a breakthrough. Caleb received Dr. Chen's preliminary report. He encrypted the findings and sent them to Eve through secure channels they'd established. By Thursday, Maria had organized a citizens group. Caleb helped them file for a temporary injunction, citing the authenticated documents as evidence. The paperwork landed on a judge's desk by noon. "We need public pressure," Eve said during their evening call. "The truth has to come out." Friday morning, an independent news website published Dr. Chen's full report. Caleb watched his phone explode with notifications. The city planning office issued an emergency stay on all demolition permits pending investigation. In his office, Caleb's hands shook as he read the mounting coverage. A knock at his door made him jump. "Turner." His supervisor looked grim. "The board wants to see you." Caleb stood, straightened his tie. "Of course." The elevator ride felt endless. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Eve. "Stay strong. You did the right thing." He took a deep breath and entered the boardroom, ready to face whatever came next. The garden's fate and his career hung in the balance. Saturday brought a flurry of legal activity. The citizens group's lawyers filed additional briefs supported by Dr. Chen's authentication. Local preservationists submitted statements about the garden's historical significance. Sunday evening, Eve called an emergency meeting at the bakery. Caleb attended via secure video link, explaining each legal document spread across her kitchen table. "The injunction is holding," he reported. "The authentication proof is solid. They can't ignore this anymore." Maria sorted papers into careful piles. "So what happens next?" "We wait," Caleb said. "The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they're turning." The following Monday morning, exactly 1 week after Caleb's first secret meeting with Eve, he sat at his desk reviewing the previous day's events in his secure journal. His phone buzzed with another text from Eve. Channel 5 requesting interviews. What do we say? Caleb typed back carefully. Nothing yet. Let the evidence speak for itself. He looked out his office window towards the garden, barely visible in the distance. A week ago, its fate had seemed sealed. Now there was hope, built on paper and ink and truth. The evidence was authentic. The story was out. Now they had to trust in justice, one careful step at a time. The morning sun barely touched the office windows when Ashford Development's press release hit the news. Caleb's phone buzzed with urgent notifications as he read the headline, "Documents alleged in garden dispute show signs of tampering." The board's statement was brutal in its simplicity. Our experts have identified multiple irregularities in the supposed historical documents. We believe these materials were altered or fabricated to obstruct legitimate business operations. Eve's bakery phone started ringing at 7:30. She wiped flour from her hands and picked up to hear Maria's worried voice. "They're saying it's all fake, Eve? All of it?" By 10 o'clock, local news vans lined the street. Eve watched through the window as reporters accosted passers-by, thrust microphones at regular customers. Henry called from a borrowed phone. "They're claiming I orchestrated the whole thing," he said, voice rough. "The board filed papers this morning suggesting I tampered with records to regain control." "That's ridiculous," Eve said, but her stomach tightened. "They're painting me as desperate, unstable. Someone leaked my medical records from that night at the shed." The afternoon brought more blows. Mayor Reed's sleek car pulled up to Ashford Development's downtown office at 2:15. Through the glass doors, Eve could see the mayor shaking hands with board members, her campaign smile firmly in place. Maria brought coffee and day-old muffins to the back room, where Eve sat with scattered papers. "The mayor's switching sides." "She's protecting her position," Eve said. "Can't risk backing a losing cause." The evening town hall meeting started calmly enough. The community centre filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Patel, Mr. Jensen, young families, elderly residents who'd known the garden for decades. But when the board's lawyer stood to speak, tension crackled. These supposed documents conveniently appeared just as development was set to begin, he said smoothly. And the only witness to their discovery was Mr. Ashford himself during an episode of confused behavior. Shouts erupted. "He's telling the truth. The garden belongs to everyone. You can't buy our history." Eve watched Henry sink lower in his chair as accusations flew. His normally perfect posture crumpled under the weight of public scrutiny. The next morning brought legal papers thick with allegations. Caleb arrived at Eve's back door before opening, his tie askew. "They're going after Henry personally," he said, spreading documents across the flour-dusted counter. "Claiming he conspired to create false records, that he's trying to manipulate company control through manufactured heritage claims." Eve scanned the dense legal language. "But the authentication? They're questioning Dr. Chen's methods, demanding new tests." Caleb loosened his tie further. "And they're painting you as his accomplice." Throughout the day, comments piled up on local news sites. "Always knew that bakery woman was hiding something. Rich man playing games with our neighborhood. Who can we trust anymore?" The third day dawned gray and cold. Eve opened the bakery to find fewer customers than usual. Regular faces turned away when she caught their eyes. At noon, Caleb called an emergency meeting in the bakery's back room. Henry joined via speakerphone, his voice tired. "The board wants blood," Caleb said plainly. "They'll keep attacking reputations, questioning motives until someone breaks." "What are our options?" Eve asked. "They might settle. Save the garden. But only if Henry steps down completely. No role in the company, no public defense of the documents. They want him silenced." Henry's sigh crackled through the phone. "If that's what it takes, don't decide yet." Eve said quickly. "We need time to think." But time was running out. That afternoon, the court clerk posted the public hearing date. 2 weeks away. Eve wrote it on her calendar with shaking hands. The rest of the day brought a stream of worried visitors to the bakery's back door. Maggie leaning on her cane, asking if they needed more signatures. Maria's teenage son offering to make posters. Mrs. Patel bringing samosas and concern. As evening settled, Eve stood in the garden, watching shadows creep across the old flower beds. The weight of the community's trust, Henry's reputation, and history itself seemed to press down on her shoulders. The hearing would determine everything: the garden's fate, Henry's future, the neighborhood's character. 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks to find a way through this maze of accusations and doubt. Inside the bakery, papers covered her kitchen table. Legal briefs, authentication reports, historical photographs. The tools of their defense waited in careful piles, but fear gnawed at her certainty. They had truth on their side, but sometimes she was learning. Truth wasn't enough. The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of activity. Eve's kitchen table became command central, covered with stacks of signed petitions and legal documents. Maria coordinated witness schedules while Maggie collected testimonials, her memory sharp as ever for dates and details. Caleb worked late into each night, his tie perpetually crooked as he prepared briefs. Local press ran daily updates, counting down to what they called the garden hearing. On hearing day, the city council chamber filled early. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in the air. The wood-paneled walls seemed to absorb the nervous whispers of the crowd. Eve sat in the front row, watching clerks arrange microphones and water pitchers. Mayor Reed took her seat at the center of the raised platform, flanked by council members. Her face was carefully neutral, practiced in political patience. The board's representatives filed in wearing identical dark suits, their leather briefcases gleaming. They claimed an entire side of the chamber, a wall of corporate authority. Henry arrived alone, looking smaller somehow in his simple navy suit. No PR team, no entourage. He nodded to Eve before taking his seat. This public hearing regarding the proposed development of the Barnes Street Historic District is now in session, the clerk announced. The gallery hushed as Maggie made her way to the podium, her cane tapping softly. At 87, she stood straight as a young tree. "I was 10 years old when my grandmother first showed me how to plant tomatoes in that garden," she began. She told me stories about the founders while we worked, how they wanted green space preserved forever, so children would always have somewhere to grow things and dream. Her voice carried decades of memory. She described community picnics, wedding photos taken by the old oak tree, children learning to garden through wars and recessions. Sarah Chen approached the microphone next, her young son clutching her hand. "I'm a single mother working 2 jobs, she said. "That garden is where Tommy learned to read. The library's summer program meets there. It's where he made his first friends when we moved here with nothing but hope." A Vietnam veteran named James Martinez described how tending a small plot helped him find peace. "Some of us need quiet, green places to heal," he said simply. Then came 10-year-old Lisa Rodriguez, a folded paper trembling in her hands. "Dear council members," she read carefully. "The garden is where my mum started getting better after she was sick. She said watching things grow gave her hope. Please don't take that away from other people who might need hope too." The morning stretched into afternoon. Person after person spoke of connection, of history, of something precious that money couldn't replace. When Henry finally rose to speak, the room grew so quiet Eve could hear the old heating system creak. He walked to the podium slowly, like a man carrying a heavy weight. "I've spent my life in boardrooms," he began, his voice rough. making deals, protecting profits, building my father's legacy. I thought that's what mattered. He paused, hands gripping the podium. I was wrong. The board members shifted in their seats as Henry continued. 2 weeks ago, I collapsed in an alley behind this neighborhood's historical society. I was alone, confused, trying to understand documents that suggested my company had buried evidence of the founder's intentions. His voice cracked slightly. A stranger helped me. She could have called the press, exposed me, gained advantage. Instead, she showed compassion. He looked directly at the board. That's what I found in this neighborhood. Not assets to acquire, but people who help each other. Who remember what matters. Henry pulled a paper from his pocket. I'm stepping down as CEO of Ashford Development, effective immediately. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. And I'm establishing a personal endowment of $5 million to create a community trust for the garden's permanent preservation. The board's lawyer stood quickly, but Henry raised his hand. There's one condition, he said. Ashford Development must agree to a mediated settlement that honors the founder's original covenant. The garden stays. The trust ensures its maintenance. The development plans are modified to preserve this heritage. He turned to face the gallery. I can't undo decades of corporate decisions that put profit above community. But I can choose, today, to do what's right. The chamber erupted in whispered conversations. The board members huddled with their lawyers, papers rustling urgently. Mayor Reed called a 30-minute recess. Eve watched Henry sink into his chair, looking both exhausted and lighter somehow. She wanted to go to him, but knew this moment needed to play out without interference. When the session resumed, the board's lead attorney approached the podium. Given new evidence and circumstances, he said stiffly, Ashford Development is prepared to enter mediation regarding modified development plans that preserve the designated garden space. Mayor Reed leaned forward. I move that we pause all development permits pending mediation and establishment of the proposed trust. She lifted her gavel. An interim agreement will be drafted immediately for all parties to sign. The gavel struck wood with a sharp crack of hope. Clerks rushed to prepare documents as afternoon light slanted through the windows. Eve watched Henry sign his name one last time as CEO, then add his personal pledge for the endowment. The board representatives signed with obvious reluctance but clear defeat. When Mayor Reed added her signature to the interim agreement, someone in the gallery began to clap. The applause spread like a wave through the chamber, not triumphant, but grateful, relieved, human. Through tears, Eve saw Maggie smiling, Maria hugging her son, children high-fiving in the back row. The garden would live on, rooted in memory and protected by paper, proof that sometimes doing right could still matter more than doing well. The next morning after the hearing, paperwork consumed the city clerk's office. Henry's hands shook slightly as he signed his formal resignation from Ashford Development's board. Eve watched from across the conference room, noting how his shoulders seemed lighter despite the weight of the moment. First item of business, Mayor Reed announced, shuffling through documents. The community trust formation. By Tuesday, lawyers had drafted the trust charter. Caleb worked through lunch hours, ensuring every detail matched the founder's original intent. The garden would be protected not just by goodwill, but by ironclad legal language. Wednesday brought the first community planning meeting in Eve's bakery. 30 neighbors crowded around tables, usually reserved for morning coffee, sketching ideas for garden restoration on paper napkins. Henry sat quietly in the corner, taking notes instead of trying to lead. We need better irrigation, Maria pointed out, drawing a rough map, and the south fence needs replacing. Thursday and Friday blurred into a parade of signatures and permits. The board formally voted to accept Henry's resignation and the modified development plan. By week's end, $5 million had been transferred into the newly established Garden Heritage Trust. Week 2 marked the beginning of real change. A local contractor volunteered to repair the garden's crumbling retaining wall. Children from the elementary school painted new signs for the herb beds. Henry showed up in work clothes, asking quietly where he could help. "The compost needs turning," Eve told him, hiding a smile as he stared at the pitchfork in confusion. By the end of the first month, the garden had a new irrigation system and restored pathways. The Historical Society created a digital archive of Maggie's oral histories, preserving decades of neighborhood memories. Eve submitted paperwork to expand the bakery's kitchen space for community classes. "Never thought I'd see the day," Maggie said, watching volunteers install new benches. "Sometimes doing right takes the long way around." The second month brought unexpected gifts. A local architecture firm offered pro bono designs for the teaching kitchen. The library started a seed-saving program. Henry attended trust meetings not as a power broker, but as someone learning to listen. One quiet evening, he found Eve closing the bakery. "I owe you an apology," he said, studying the floor, "and a thank you." "For what?" "For showing me what community really means, for not letting me hide when it would have been easier." Eve wiped flour from her hands. "You did the hard thing in the end. That matters." Their conversations remained careful but real. Two people discovering how to be neighbors instead of opponents. By the third month, the garden bloomed with new life. Raised beds overflowed with summer vegetables. Children's artwork decorated the fence posts. The bakery's teaching kitchen hosted its first class, Eve showing a dozen eager students how to make her famous sourdough. The Trust Advisory Council met weekly, with Henry offering quiet suggestions rather than demands. He'd found a different kind of influence, the kind earned through showing up, listening, and doing honest work. "We should celebrate," Maria suggested during a planning meeting. "Mark the first growing season since we saved this place." The idea sparked excitement. A harvest festival would honor both the garden's history and its renewal. Committees formed to plan music, food, and activities. Eve promised special harvest bread using herbs from the garden's new beds. "Will you come?" she asked Henry after a trust meeting. "Not as a former CEO or donor, just as a neighbor." He nodded, understanding the distinction. "I'd like that. I'm learning to be better at just being present." The festival planning brought the neighborhood together in new ways. Mrs. Patel offered to teach Indian cooking classes. Mr. Jensen started a workshop on basic carpentry. The garden became not just a place to grow food, but to grow community. 3 months after the hearing, the garden stood transformed. Not just physically, though the new benches, restored paths, and thriving plants showed obvious care. The real change was in the people who gathered there, who had learned that sometimes victory meant simply showing up day after day to tend what mattered. As August ended, the Harvest Festival preparations were in full swing. Maggie oversaw the historical display, featuring photos old and new. Maria coordinated volunteers. Eve tested recipes for her demonstration kitchen debut. The garden that had almost been lost now anchored something larger, a neighborhood that had remembered how to grow together, even through the hardest seasons. The morning dawned crisp and clear, just like that spring day 6 months ago when everything began. The same sparrows darted between tree branches, their songs a familiar chorus. Eve stood in her bakery doorway, listening to the bell's gentle chime as Maria opened up. The Harvest Festival stretched across the entire garden and spilled onto the surrounding sidewalks. Wooden stalls lined the paths, displaying everything from fresh vegetables to handmade crafts. Children darted between tables decorated with autumn flowers and gourds, their laughter mixing with folk music from the local band setting up near the new pergola. Can you believe it?" Maria asked, arranging still warm loaves on their booth. 6 months ago, we thought we'd lose all this." Eve watched volunteers finishing the morning setup. The new community kitchen gleamed, its windows reflecting early sunlight. Inside, teams prepared free meals using garden produce and Eve's recipes. The aroma of baking bread and simmering soup drifted across the grounds. Maggie supervised the installation of a bronze plaque near the garden entrance, her cane tapping as she directed placement. The plaque listed founding families and documented the community's successful fight to preserve their heritage. She'd insisted on including everyone's names, even those who'd initially opposed their efforts. By mid-morning, the festival was in full swing. Mrs. Patel demonstrated traditional Indian recipes in the teaching kitchen, while Mr. Jensen helped children plant fall bulbs. The waiting list for cooking classes already stretched into spring. Mayor Reed arrived around 11, looking relaxed without campaign posters or press handlers. She gathered everyone near the main gate for an announcement. "Today, I'm proud to sign the Heritage Space Protection Ordinance," she declared, holding up an official document. "This legislation ensures that designated community spaces like this garden will be permanently protected from development. Your success here has become a model for other neighborhoods." Applause rippled through the crowd. Eve noticed Caleb standing quietly at the back, a satisfied smile on his face. He caught her eye and nodded. The legal framework he'd helped create would now protect dozens of similar spaces across the city. Near noon, Henry appeared without fanfare, wearing jeans and carrying gardening gloves in his back pocket. He'd learned to move through the crowd not as a CEO but as another pair of helping hands. The transformation still surprised Eve. The man, who once commanded boardrooms, now took genuine pleasure in turning compost and teaching children about worm farms. "The community oven's ready," Maria called out. They'd built it last month, a brick hearth designed for neighborhood baking days. Eve and Henry met beside the oven, where she'd prepared a special loaf for its first official use. The dough incorporated herbs from the garden, and a sourdough starter she'd maintained for 15 years. "Would you do the honors?" she asked, offering Henry the peel. His hands were steadier now as he slid the bread into the glowing oven. They stood together, watching through the brick opening as the loaf rose and browned. Throughout the afternoon, old wounds continued healing. Eve overheard Mrs. Chen chatting with Mr. Rodriguez about expanding the children's reading circle, the same neighbors who'd argued bitterly during the development fight. Near the flower beds, former opponents worked side by side, planting autumn chrysanthemums. The festival stretched into evening. Lanterns twinkled in the growing dusk, and the band switched to slower tunes. The teaching kitchen served its last bowls of soup as families lingered on new benches, sharing desserts and stories. As the crowd thinned, Eve found herself walking the garden's paths in the fading light. Henry fell into step beside her, both of them quiet among the rustling leaves. "Thank you," he said simply, breaking the silence. "For seeing something in me worth saving, even when I couldn't." Eve smiled, remembering that first desperate day behind the bakery. "Well, I've always believed in second chances. Like dough, sometimes you have to knock it down to help it rise better." They reached the community oven, its bricks still warm. Eve pulled out the day's final loaf, golden and fragrant. Without ceremony, she broke it in half, offering a piece to Henry. Around them, the garden settled into evening peace, tomorrow's promises already tucked into its soil. The bakery bell chimed softly in the distance, the same bell that had marked that life-changing spring morning. Eve watched as neighbors shared the bread, passing pieces down the tables. More than a garden had been saved here. They'd grown something rarer, a community that remembered how to nourish its roots while welcoming new growth.